Good morning and good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to Zilker Technologies webinar series. Today we're going to be chatting about IBM's ODM product, specifically Decision Governance. My name is Dave Heckeroth and I'll be your presenter today. I would like to share a little bit of information about the webinar. We're turning everybody's mic in audio mute mode until the end of the presentation, where we'll be opening up the floor for questions and answers. If in between that time you do have questions, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat screen. We'll hold those till the end and get back to you when we can. Okay, so my name, like I said, Dave Heckeroth. I am the Zilker Technologies ODM Practice Director. I've been in this BRMS space for quite a long time, 25 plus years. I'm certified as a BRMS developer in 3 of Gartner Group's Magic Quadrant tools. I have a wide range of industry experience in insurance, healthcare, manufacturing. My hometown is Seattle, Washington, and I'd like to take just a minute and welcome some of our customers and interested friends on the line. Because this is going to be a recorded session, I won't go ahead and use anybody's name. Welcome to the East Coast. We've got a healthcare organization joining today. In the Central Time Zone, we have an insurance organization. And then in Pacific Northwest, manufacturing organization. Welcome to you all. Just to give you a little bit of context today, I want to let you know that our Decision Governance series has really 3 different areas. Today is a bit of a semi-technical briefing. We're going to actually be doing a demo, going into some of the finer details. So it's not going to be all the way up at the executive level, and we certainly won't be getting into the hardcore details of some of the capabilities, but we do want to share with you many of those capabilities, and so that's why we're here today. This webinar has a host of items that we're going to be covering, from publishing, from Rule Designer, creating a new release in ODM using the Business Console, understanding a little bit about the access which is offered as part of ODM from a users and group administration perspective. We're going to be creating and developing a release that has change activities. I'll show you a little bit about snapshots and how to restore from previous versions, kind of this whole backup recovery capability. Then we'll test using our capabilities in Decision Center Business Console. We'll validate the change activities. And then lastly, we'll deploy our newly created decision service with changes to the rule execution server. Okay, so let's start at the top. From just an overview perspective, some ask, what is decision governance or rule governance? And by the way, I use those 2 words, those 2 phrases interchangeably. You'll hear me throughout today. There is a subtle distinction between those 2. But for today's topic, let's just call those the same thing. So from a short answer perspective, right, decision governance is all about managing the changes and the deployments of decision systems, right? Quite simple. But the longer answer, if you listen to IBM and some of their explanation on the topic, they're going to tell you that decision systems are managed from a governance perspective with their Decision Center console product. They have 2. One is the primary, being the Business Console, and this allows business users to work with a ready-to-use life cycle process to manage the change activity of those decisions and the deployment properties of that decision as it goes from a development change environment to a rule execution server environment. But all those things aside, whether you like the short answer or the longer answer, most agree that when we govern decision systems, we include things like defining roles for the actors and the whole governance process. We're talking about a repeatable process to manage the change life cycle, right? We're talking about reporting capabilities to give clarity to the fact that the change activity is going as you expect. We're talking about tracking systems that allow auditing of previously run transactions or inquiries of the service. We're talking about the ability to do backups and restores and things of that nature. Some of these things we'll talk about in future Tech Talks. Like I said, today is just about the release process, and the deployment process. We'll touch on some of these other things, but they'll be followed up in other Tech Talks. So moving on to the why do decision governance, right? Let's assume that you're all on board with decision governance from a technology perspective. Why do that? Well, clearly it's the whole idea of better managing and modeling those business processes by having a repeatable process to govern the changes and the deployment capability. You're going to have better communication with your stakeholders. You're going to have a more accurate change process and implementation process. You're going to be able to do that better, faster, and cheaper than just using manual change processes altogether. And when we try to apply changes to business decisions that are in an unmanaged way, we're always asking these type of questions, right? Am I going to break something? How do I undo a change? What's the impact of that change? When's that change effective? All these type of questions, that come about when we talk about managing decisions and the challenge of doing ungoverned decisions. I like to think that that's a very dangerous process when it's an ungoverned process. Before we jump into the actual demonstration and before we go any further, let me share with you a business challenge that we're going to be using to demonstrate some of these capabilities today. On the screen, you see a business process flow for an insurance application where they're trying to gather information about an applicant. They then verify that information, and somewhere through the process, they're going to make this determination on whether or not that applicant is a good risk for the organization. That is a quality activity for decision management. And you can see that as you go through the happy path of this application, there might be other areas where there'll be situations for good decision-making capabilities. But today we're going to use this scenario where we determine the pricing tier, we provide some risk scoring, and just so that we understand the business challenge to the best of our ability before we get started, let me share this textual information with you. TLP is an insurance company, like I said, that's going to rate its insurance applicants. It's going to rate them on three major areas. It's going to consider their financial stability, it's going to consider their property risk, and it's going to consider their coverage liability, all as sub-decisions of the ultimate goal, which is determine what an applicant's final pricing tier will be. You can see from this table here below, this gives you the information associated to our first sub-decision, financial stability, and there's a number of premises that will ultimately determine what a person's financial stability is. And you can kind of see in this table how you read from left to right and determine that financial stability score. In the same way, we have also captured information about setting the property risk and what sort of attributes influence the property risk score, carrying on to the third subdecision, which is coverage liability. We can see how there are attributes that influence coverage liability. And then finally, the final decision, which takes all those three subdecisions and correspondingly sets the pricing tier. Now, that's going to be our business challenge of today. Okay, when we start from the beginning, we're really starting from Rule Designer. This is the environment where the developer will come in, they'll set up the object model structure for the decision service, and what we're going to do is we're going to take it from the step after that. So what I've done is I've really created a TLP application with some base rules and an object model. And I'm going to take that from Rule Designer. You can see that on my screen now. It's the Eclipse-based product. And I'm going to go and publish that to Decision Center so that we can modify it with the Business Console. In order to do that, I'm right-clicking on the project file, going down to Decision Center, and you can see it gives me the opportunity to connect. I hit the Connect button, and you can see it provides the URL. I enter the user ID admin, and give me just a second. I'll enter the password. I hit connect, and then up here it'll tell me that that connection was established. And here's one of the secrets you're going to want to remember. You click the next button, and be sure to click the Use Decision Governance Framework, which tells the server to apply certain features to it. Say finish, and then I'll be able to go to the Business Console and see that decision service. Let's go ahead and navigate there now, and we can see that before we do the promotion of the decision service, there's nothing there. But if we go ahead and refresh this screen, we're going to see that it then puts out from a multiple tab perspective what's in the library. When I click on library, I see that my TLP decision service is now in the Business Console, ready for me to operate on it. So that's all that's really involved in publishing from Rule Designer to Decision Center, specifically the Business Console. And we're going to start next, talk about releases and change activities. Before we continue on with the demo, I just wanted to highlight something for you, and that is when we're talking about the release in ODM, it really is a situation where you create an object in the console, and that console initially starts out with a status of in progress. If it continues on through the happy path, it then gets the ready for approval status and ultimately the complete status. It also has a couple of rework cycles. One is if when you get ready to approve the release, you decide that for whatever reason you want to reject it, you can do that, and then it flows back into the in progress. Also, when you're in the in progress state, you can cancel the release so that nothing happens with it. And I imagine that does happen from time to time, but I just want to draw your attention that the release lifecycle has a number of different states that it can be in, and we're going to view that in just one second. So now we're back at our Business Console, and we're ready to create a release and a change activity and move on with testing our newly modified decision service. So we're going to click on the TLP service that was pushed from Rule Designer. We can see that the only thing there initially is the initial release. And in order for us to make changes to the decision service, we need to create a new release object. And you can see what I've done here is I've given the release a name. I've said base it on the initial release, so where's its starting point, given some description of what I want to do, a due date, and then specified some of the roles for this particular release management. So now I'm going to go ahead and say create, and it will go ahead and create that release for me, drops me into that. If I want to view that as if I had come in from outside, I can go back to the TLP section. Notice I've got the initial release and my newly created November release, which is still in progress, as we just talked about in our statuses. So let's go into the November release, and this is where we're going to actually do the work. We have just a little bit of setup to do because we can't just drop into modifying the service. We have to tell it what we're going to do. So it allows us to create a new change activity, just like the release activity. And this is where we hold changed values. So here we've given the change activity a name, a description, and again, assigned the roles for the particular change activity. We're going to go ahead and create the change activity associated with the release, and it will drop us into that. Let's go back and take a look at the outside view, and that says TLP has a release called November 2016, and in that release we've got a change activity called Change the Poor Rule. So let's go ahead and actually see what that looks like. Here I've just come into the change activity, right? We can see with the description, change activity. And on the left-hand side, there's a hierarchical view. I've just toggled down to one of the rule packages that says pricing tier. And here's an example of the poor rule that we're going to modify. we can see here that rule number 9 and rule number 10 allow us to determine financial stability and property risk, and from the values obtained there, assign, reject, or refer. Well, it's just come to my attention that when it's a poor financial stability, but the property risk is not high, we're going to give it a different rating other than refer. The underwriters don't want to see it. We want to change the value here. So we'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to edit the decision table by clicking on the edit icon, and it gives me the ability to view those particular rules in different ways, but we're going to take the way that it was shown to us. And we can see that Rule 10 is here. It has poor, and instead of property risk not equal to high, refer, we're going to come in and we're going to edit this condition. We're going to say that no longer is it a referable item, but we're going to give it a rating of a D, which just means that it's going to be priced differently. It doesn't have to go to an underwriter. You notice we already have an A, B, and a C, and so this is the last category. We're going to say save. It gives us an opportunity to just put in some information about the change, perhaps the person requesting the change. We say create a new version, and then we can see it gives us back a visual view of the decision table, and in fact that Rule 10 has been changed. After we verify that the changes had been made, we can see that in this view status. We simply come over to the right-hand side, metadata, and share with the system that the authoring is now complete, the approval is complete, and the status of the change activity then gets changed to complete. We can verify that by going back to the change activity and seeing that it now shows up in the complete offering, and the only thing left is the validation step. Now, from a validation perspective, we can either come in and apply some specific tests at this level. Simply because this was a very simple change, we're going to go ahead and catalog this as a completed section, and we'll save our testing until we reach the deployment stage, and we'll test it from outside of ODM using SOAP UI. After we change all the metadata tags here, we can see that the status of this particular validation step is complete, and if we go back to where we were before, we can see that the change activities are complete, the validation activities are complete, and now the release, although it's in progress, is ready to be promoted to a complete status. So we can enter into it. We see this metadata to the right. We can see that the status is still in progress. We can proceed to approval for the release itself. So that's to say that we can have one or many of these change activities. All these have their own workflow, and then once we get them all done as part of the November 2016 release, we can then say proceed to approval for all of them. The fact is here we only have one. So it's ready for approval, and now we're going to check into the approvers area, and here we've got April the approver, and it's not reviewed, and we're going to say approve those changes. Gives us a dialog box asking us, are you sure? And then once this gets complete, you're going to note that the actual status of the whole release is complete, and we can now actually go and deploy this. When we come back to the general view of the releases, we see the initial release is complete, and all of our changes and the status of the November 2016 release are also complete. And so from here, we're actually going to go and deploy this particular change release to our rule execution server. Okay, in order to deploy our newly changed decision service from Decision Center, we simply click on the release that's been completed, and we can see across the top that there's a number of tabs to consider. One of those is deployments, and when I promoted this particular decision service from the Rule Designer, it had in it a deployment configuration. Now, that deployment configuration points to a particular server that it wants to deploy to. So when I click the checkbox, I have the ability to deploy directly from here or up on the tab bar. So either one will do the same thing. I click on it, and it reminds me that I'm deploying November 2016, and it highlights the fact that it knows about some target machines that I've told it about. One of those is Pure App Server, which I'm using for my tests. We can see that the last deployed version was 1.1, and here in this particular case, it's creating a new version, 1.2. It gives me a little bit of information about what it's relying on in order to provide this particular deployment, and so it gives a snapshot which was created by the system at the time that I closed the release, or at the time that I explained that the release was at a completed status. So I then hit the deploy button, and it reminds me that I can check out some information about it reporting. You can see that it went from a play arrow to a checkbox, and what that tells me is that the report has then been generated, two parts: the configuration part that actually does deployment, and the reports section, which actually gives you information about the deployment. Excuse me. And you can see here that it gives you a summary screen with, quite a bit of information about, what the name of it is, what the rule set was, what the old version on the server was, what the new version was, the snapshot that it used to actually deploy the service, things of that nature. And so that's good reference information for your change management people. And so it has officially gone out to the rule execution server. Let's actually go to the rule execution server and kind of verify the date and time and version. So I'll now go out to my rule execution server where I just deployed. And you can see that just by inspecting the navigational pane, I can see that my TLP decision service has an application out there. It originally got put out a number of days ago. If I click on the app in order to go down into the rule sets that have been deployed, we can see that version 1.2 got deployed today, November 1st, date of this webinar, and of course the time is indeed correct as well. So this is kind of a visual cue that what we have is there and is working. Now, just as a reminder, we're going to go off now and run a few tests, and there's information from the rule execution server that can help us with that. Let me just point you in the direction where that is. If we actually click on the rule set, one of the options up on the sheet view is to retrieve the descriptor file. And what this does is it allows you to have an index or an outline of the particular service call. So you can click SOAP and download, and it will download the WASDL to your machine. And you can then use that when defining your SOAP UI request, and I'll show you that right now. So here I have SOAP UI up, and I'm using version 5. If I were to start a new project, I could take that WADL file or WSDL file from the rule execution server and use it to define the interface in this particular thing. What I've done is I've already actually built this out, and I have two tests. One here called the poor not high refer. This was the original condition. You can see that I have the request all defined with the corresponding values put out there. And then what I have is the response. Let me hit the play button, and I'll show you that when I execute this on the older version of the decision service, in fact, I do receive the refer that I had before I made my rule changes. Then what I can do is I can bring up the new test, which is the same exact object structure, just with values that point to, entry point that points to a new version of the service. And here I'll select 1.2 because our report showed us that that is the rule set that I'm going to want to execute in my rule execution server. I can hit play and then go down and see it does in fact return the value D. So I guess this is confirmation that I can go make those rule changes, push those rule changes to a rule execution server, and then I use my external SOAP tool in order to validate that the new decision is returning the values that I expect. Okay, now that we've walked through the whole rule governance process, albeit very, very quickly, I wanted to open up the floor for some questions and see if anybody wanted to discuss, anything of interest. I have gotten a couple of texts via the client line, the IM line. So let me read one of those, and while we're waiting to see if others want to join with calls. The first question from the East Coast was, what are some common challenges when doing decision governance for the very first time? Okay, it's a great question, and one that we often hear. I would say that there's probably 3 or 4 things that really represent themselves either as challenges or things that require a little bit more detail in order to understand completely. And I would say one of those has to do with defining the user roles and groups for the security model for rule governance. And as luck would have it, we're going to be doing another webcast that talks about that in some greater detail. So stay tuned, and we'll certainly get into that. But I would say that the role and group security model is one that I don't want to say it tricks people, but it causes them to spend a little bit extra time. And we'll actually be putting out a separate, maybe not a webinar, but information video about that. I would say the second thing has to do with the idea of snapshots within rule governance. There are kind of some special features, special characteristics under which a snapshot is going to be applied. It might not be exactly used the way people think of snapshots in other forms. Again, this is going to be another source of logs, so keep your eyes peeled for that. What else would I say? The other thing I would say, not that it catches people for the first time, but there are capabilities in ODM's rule governance that really benefit the change administrator, the person who actually supplies the changes to the deployment environments, the person trying to understand when there are conflicts. The change that we did here today was rather trivial, but you can imagine that we can get into some pretty complex changes, and that kind of leads me to the fourth item of managing rule conflicts. It's not rocket science, certainly, but ODM, excuse me, doesn't provide all of the conflict resolution capabilities that some other tools might offer. Okay, so let's move on to the second question. What is the most common error you see with rule governance framework? Common errors. Well, certainly one that comes to mind is when we develop a decision service, at least the initial version of it, using Rule Designer, and then we want to port that to Decision Center using the rule governance framework. You'll note earlier I reminded people to make that checkbox in the promotion process. And I would say that's a pretty common error. People want to create a release for a particular decision service, and when they get up and look in their Decision Center Business Console, they don't see their service there, right? And so that might be one reason why, because they forgot to check that decision governance checkbox. So that's one. I would say the other common error that I sometimes see is that when we deploy from Rule Designer to Decision Center, and we then make some changes in Decision Center using, our web-based interface of the Business Console, at some point in time, we'll do the testing, and then we determine that we want to deploy the Decision Center version of the service to the Rule Execution Server. And in order to do that, the deployment configuration that's set up initially in Rule Designer connects to the server, but that doesn't guarantee that your server environment knows about that same server. So it's pretty common error that when people are in Decision Center for the very first time, they have to remember to go over to the Enterprise Console and define the server that they want to deploy their updated decision service to. So oftentimes the symptom of this will be you go into your deployment configuration in Decision Center, you'll attempt to execute it, and the target servers will be all gray. And they'll be all gray because Decision Center does not know about those particular servers. And so you have to go add those as available servers from Decision Center standpoint. So I would say that's probably the second most common error that I see or that I get calls on. And the other thing I would like to say is that it's really important that as people develop these decision services, they follow some best practice and guidelines. Over the years of developing services, me and my team have developed quite a few of those, and we're happy to share those, especially with our consulting engagements. And so as each client, as the people who are listening to this, as you go and develop your decision services, your library of services, you're going to capture best practices and ideas, both from an authoring perspective, from a deployment perspective, from a whole host of capabilities. And we can help you with that jumpstart, but certainly if it's not us, or perhaps it's someone else, then I would say just make sure that you capture those ideas, you capture your lessons learned after developing and delivering those applications. I find that one of the very best things I get out of a post-implementation follow-up are very documented lessons learned. And I would encourage you that as you go through your initial development process and subsequent development processes for decision services, make sure you keep track of those lessons learned. That will be the golden nugget that you take with you and improve your experience month over month, year over year. So let me check again to see if there's any other questions. I'll wait just a second to see if any are coming through. Mark, do you see any more on the IM line? No, I guess not. So at this point, I'll give you a few minutes back. Thank you very much for attending, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions. My email address was on the very front page, and for those in attendance, I will be sending paper follow-up of all the presentation materials. So thank you so much. Take care. Have a good day.